Welcome to Cooking on the Kenai. Today I'm going to show you how to make pie dough. Down here on my counter I have all my mise en place done, so everything is out ready for me to use as I do my demonstration. In my bowl I have 1 1/4 cups of all-purpose flour. To that I am going to add a teaspoon of salt and blend that in with my fork. Then I am going to add 1/3 cup of shortening. Your shortening has to be cut in to your flour. You can do that one of 3 ways. You can cut it in like I'm doing with a fork. You can use 2 butter knives and cut it in like this. Or you can use a pastry blender. I prefer to use a fork. I have done this way most of my life. So you need to cut this in until it looks like fine crumbs. As this takes a little bit, I am going to get my bowl of pie crust that I have already worked and cut in all my shortening. And as you can see, it's all roughly the same size. It looks like meal. Okay? To this, you are going to add ice water. The reason you add ice water is so that the fat stays solid. So I'm going to add this. You'll need 3 to 5 tablespoons roughly, maybe more depending on the day, whether it's humid outside or in your house, and the temperature. So I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of ice water to start with and stir that in. And you don't want to add all of it at one time. So you stir that in, and as you can see, it's starting to form little balls of dough, and then add it a tablespoon at a time after that. Stir it in well. Make sure you don't get any ice cubes in your water that you're putting in your bowl. That kind of makes a little problem when you roll out your dough. As you can see, my dough is starting to come together. It's starting to hydrate all that flour. And as I stir it around, you can see that it's starting to form a ball, but there's a few little light spots on the bottom of crumbs. So I'm going to add, maybe half a teaspoon more of water and stir that around. And it forms a ball of dough, like that. Okay, when you touch this dough, it feels moist, but it's not sticky. On my pastry mat here, I have put a towel, a damp towel underneath it, so it's not going to move around when I use my rolling pin. I'm going to flour lightly my surface, spread that around. I'm going to take my dough out of my bowl and form it into a disc, trying to handle it as little as possible, because the more you handle it, the heat from your hands melt that shortening and won't give you that flaky texture. I'm going to roll my rolling pin into my flour, and then I'm going to take and roll it out, center outward in all directions. I have this handy little mat, and it tells you that if you're going to make an 8-inch pie, you need to roll it this size, 9 or 10-inch. I am making a 9-inch pie, and so you just need to roll that out from the center outward in all directions until you reach that circle if you happen to have this wonderful little pastry mat here that works real well. Or if you do not have one of these handy dandy things, you roll out your dough until it is roughly 2 inches larger than your pie dish. Okay, so that is roughly 2 inches larger than my pie dish all the way around. To get this up off the mat, I take a leveling spatula and I'm going to rub it against the mat underneath the dough to help lift it. So as you can see, I'm using the spatula directly on the mat. So I slide it under there and lift, and I don't want to stretch my dough as I pick it up. Fold this into halves, and then you want to fold it into quarters to help get it into your pie dish. You need to center your pie crust in your pan and gently unfold it. Like this. Okay, as you can see, it's not down in the pan. So you need to take your dough and lift it up the edges and push it into the pan. You do not want to stretch it, because if you stretch the pie dough, you're going to end up having it shrink when it bakes, especially if you are going to make a baked pie shell for a cream or a meringue pie. So you lift those edges until they go in there. As you can see, I've got a couple of problems. Here's a ripped area. So I'm going to take a little bit of water on my finger and I'm going to glue it back together, because flour and water make a paste. I have another little problem right over here. And one right there. Okay, so one of the things that I always do when I make a pie is to make it a little bit taller. So I take my extra dough that I have on the outside edge and I lift it up about 1/2 inch. Kind of pinch it together, not real tight, but you just kind of lift it up and pinch it. So you get a taller pie crust. You can put more filling in it that way. So once I get all the way around, I'm going to show you how to flute this pie shell. Okay, my grandmother always taught me to use my 2 index fingers and my thumb. So I'm going to set my index fingers next to each other with a space in between for my thumb to push. And I'm going to push my thumb through there, move my fingers over to where the left finger is where the right finger was, and go around my pie crust. And it makes a beautiful fluted edge. If your dough has fallen back down, you need to just pull it back up. Now, one of the things that I always recommend people to do is to kind of lean that dough back a little bit over the edge of the pie pan. And the reason I tell people to do that is so that it doesn't fall into your pie as it's baking. Once that shortening starts to melt, it has a tendency to allow that dough to kind of fall in. So if you just lean it back a little bit over the edge of your pie pan, it doesn't do that. Now you've got all these little pieces of dough hanging down. You can take your fork or you can take your leveling spatula and you just gently cut those all off, all the way around your pie. Now here is a beautiful pie crust for a custard pie like pecan or pumpkin. If you are going to make a cream pie or a meringue pie where you have to have a baked shell, what you have to do to this is dock it. And docking means to poke holes in it about every ½ inch or so all the way around the sides. And on the bottom, all the way across the bottom, so that it doesn't puff up when you cook it. A lot of the times I will go both directions on the bottom of my crust. At this point, you can either blind bake your crust by just putting the docked shell into the oven without anything in it and bake it, or blind baking is also using parchment paper or foil that you set in your pie shell, adding dried beans to it to hold it down so that the bottom of the pie shell does not puff up when you bake it. To blind bake with parchment, you cut a piece of parchment paper roughly 1 inch or 2 larger than your pie pan, and you put it in your pie shell, your docked pie shell, just like that, and pour in about 1 cup of dried beans. I prefer black because they hold the heat very well, and spread them around in your pie shell. The other way to do this is to use foil if you don't have parchment paper. Roll down those edges so that your pie edges can brown real well, and pour in your beans. You would bake this in the oven for your 10 to 12 minutes until it's lightly golden brown. Remember, when you do a blind bake with beans, do not try to cook the beans after you have used them in the oven. You always end up with a little bit of extra pie dough. And one of the things that I like to do with that is to gather it up into a little ball and roll it out fairly thin. Place it in another pie pan and sprinkle it with cinnamon and sugar. This will probably take, this little piece right here, will probably take about 1 teaspoon of sugar and 1/8 teaspoon of cinnamon. Now, if you don't have 1/8 teaspoon, what you do is you measure 1/4 teaspoon, and that is 1/8 teaspoon. So you can measure that into your sugar, stir it around till it's all one color, or as close to that as you can get it. Pour it on your pie crust and spread it around evenly. And bake this in a 425-degree oven for about 8 to 10 minutes, or until it's lightly browned around the outside edges. Here is our pie crust that we baked in the oven, and as you can see, it's lightly golden brown around the outside. It feels firm, and when you break it open, it's nice and flaky.